Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and hey, you can do this. Because this is Airwindows VerbTiny. Although maybe it's not as tiny as all that. Look, it just became infinite. This is because VerbTiny uses some of the same controls as Galactic from back in the day. Notice that this has the replace knob, and the replace knob is what lets you move a single knob and put it to infinite sustain. But check this out. Not only do we have DRes, which works on the infinite sustain like this, and filter, but see this wider control? Check this out. So it might not be that clear what this is doing. So we will allow it to bring in some other sounds. It's a Proteus piano sound. Now notice that little bit there? We had high notes, and they were dumb notes, but that doesn't matter. High notes followed by low notes. If you listen to that in full reverb, well, clearly that is in the reverb. But check out some of the tricks that I can do with it. Watch this. Same settings, except for wider has gone between 0 and 0.5. Notice how the stereo effect became much greater? Now let's do it with lots of replace on. What we have is a reverb where you can set it to do this extreme stereo stuff, because the center of the wider control is a dual mono reverb, but 0 is a normal reverb. Let me see if I can find something better to demonstrate that with. For instance, drums. So if we put it on drums, we've got a hi-hat on one side and the kick drum sort of on another. So if we set it to, for instance, no replace, you can hear that the reverb, which is now full reverb, is following the stereo image perfectly. Watch what happens when I put wider to 0. That's producing more of a normal stereo room type sound. But here's where things get interesting. So I mentioned that, you can set replace to whatever for different amounts of sustain on the reverb. We've got very little sustain right now. We're not doing any derez. We're not doing any filtering. And wider is at 0. I've showed you 0, and I've showed you 0.5. What do you suppose 1 is on wider? One is actually hyperwide. What that is the same normal reverb, a room-style reverb. That is a stereo reverb, not dual mono, but it's phase flipped. One of the sides is inverted, meaning what is originally a kind of center-heavy reverb, and then you can go to dual mono, and then you can go to the phase flipped one, meaning that it is side-heavy rather than center-heavy. Let's explore what that's like on this drum sound with maybe a little bit more replace. I can even bring a little bit of the dry back in. Quick note. This is meant to be kind of a weird retro reverb. This doesn't have all the same features as the reverbs under my K series, which are designed to be more like physical spaces. And it doesn't have a pre-delay, because on my recent reverbs that are meant to be much more like physical spaces, the pre-delay is fancy. It's got early reflections in it, which sometimes behave differently from the regular reverb, and are producing sort of a spattering of echoes from all over the stereo image that are related to the size of the eventual reverb. This doesn't have that. This has no pre-delay. It's meant to blend the sound. And let's explore what happens when you blend the two reverbs that are built into this, which we have not heard that yet, other than, I think, in the very intro. So, normal sound, dual mono sound, inverted sound. But if I start combining them, listen. We get a kind of hybrid. This is sort of part of the way through. So we've got a slightly wider but still relatively normal reverb sound. And the texture changed a little bit. We can go to the dual mono. But then we can go beyond it to the hyperwide. And it makes a more complicated sound, because this, which is essentially like an experimental reverb, I'd like to continue developing this, and I might have another idea in mind. But this is running two separate reverbs, and if you have it at either 0 on wider or 0.5 or 1, you're actually only hearing one of the reverbs. I did a Blue Sky post earlier where I was talking about trying to make this work and doing an entirely separate arrangement for dual mono, and it just kind of broke after a point where I had it up and running. And so I decided, get into the technicalities just a little bit, I decided that rather than redesign the dual mono version, or just take it as the exact clone of the regular version but dual mono, I'd flip the sides, because the sides of this reverb are separate. It's the same thing that I'm doing for most of mine, where you have the reverb matrix, and then one channel runs through the matrix this way, and the other channel runs through the matrix that way. So it uses the same matrix each time. It uses all the same values, but they're being combined differently in stereo. And I just flipped the polarity. So what that means is, if you have the regular one, like for instance this, here's your regular one. One of the sides is going through the matrix one way and the other side's going through it another way. If I make it be dual mono, it's basically the same thing but even more purely, because the way the stereo one works is the output of the one matrix goes into the input of the other channel and then back again, like a sort of an infinity symbol, a loop going through both of the channels in turn. And the dual mono, because it's dual mono, just has the channels going through only themselves. And that is why when you have a perfectly stereo thing happening in the dual mono setting, like I did the piano effect right at the beginning, you can have a little sound here. I can do that again, I think. Let's find out. Okay, so no replace on that, but... And I'll pull it back just a hair so that you can hear a little better. So listen to where the high notes are coming from. High notes are coming from hard right, and that's because the original sound in dry, the high note was more to the right and the low note is more to the left. There's some stereo content there, and it's exaggerating that. And then the inverse one, the setting wider to 1, meaning it's going to be going through the loops, but the output of one of the channels is flipped, meaning that what would originally end up being a fairly mid-heavy sound becomes a fairly side-heavy sound instead. And dry-wet is still exactly the same as before, but this produces the reverb effect where the space feels wider than wide, as it were, because most of its information, whatever information it has in it that is essentially centered, is instead being flipped to be side channel only. And yeah, I've got a B3 sound here. So what I can do is show you the basic feel of these spaces. Excuse me. As very stereo sounding spaces, this is the normal room sound. So there you have it, acting like it's sitting in a regular room. Give it a little bit of the blend, and it's still fairly centered, but now we're hearing both of the reverbs. Then dual mono kind of heightens the stereo effects in an interesting way. And the stereo is a little flashier. You can pull just a bit back from that if you want to have a hint of the roominess to it. We're changing the shape of the space. And then if we go to the full side one, it's going to be trying to hyper-widenize everything. And we can give that a combination between that and dual mono as well. For more of a flashy stereo effect. And then we can also put this on some really extensive reverb. And if you listen to the shape of this space, centered space, wide space, which is dual mono, hyper wide, which is inverted center, back to center, and then we can do the intermediate spaces, and I'm just going to gradually progress across as it does this. Dual mono. Then even wider, all the way to fully wide, which is the inverse of just raw. And then I was going to throw just a little bit of vocals because of something that relates to today's bonus audio for people who are pledging a whole bunch of money. $10 a month counts for me as a whole bunch of money to the Patreon. I decided to use something which you probably haven't heard or haven't heard for many years, even if you're fairly old, but uses some of these techniques. It's Genesis Home by the Sea from that big hit album that they had, the Genesis eponymous album in the 80s. Turns out the vinyl mix of this and several other ones, like for instance Duke, is extraordinary, and also the reason they went and remixed it as soon as CDs came out. Because it sounds like a 70s record, but it's using some of this stuff. And if I take this and amend it in such a way that replaces all the way down, so there's very little delay, and then, for instance, either it can be just dry or it can be dual mono. This voice track is actually a mono central voice, but meaning that the dual mono will try to sit in a centered sound. But the important thing about that is some of that early stuff, and I definitely include this Genesis album. Back in the days when this stuff was coming out, people used it without predelay. And it's a big part of an 80s and a 90s sound, and a bunch of things like dub techno and stuff that came out and people had their devices, but they didn't necessarily know to get into things like predelays. And so you ended up getting these very dense and rich tones because the tone was being made out of a raw sound and then maybe not a very extended reverb, but one that's fairly loud. So what you're going to hear now is, firstly, the raw vocal. As too much from one who cannot dare. And then let's throw 50% reverb on it. As too much from one who cannot dare. And what you hear
Such demands are hard things to forgive.
Is that kind of effect where the reverb is kind of hot. There's a lot of it, but it's not actually delayed and it's not actually sustaining very much. And we can even fool with the wider to either do things like have both of the effects be present. So there's the main reverb, but then there's also the dual mono, and they're both happening.
As too much from one who cannot dare.
Or the beyond that, where we're going part of the way over towards hyperwide.
As too much from one who cannot dare. As too much from one who cannot dare.
And there,
such demands are hard things to forgive.
There you have a monovocal where it's getting a hyper-wide stereo effect, and it is having the effect of not making the reverb space sound deeper, but it's just kind of livening it up. It's going out to the sides in an interesting way. And these were all things that people could do quite easily in the 1980s because they had things like these reverbs and things to play with, and would just set them up and go. So there you have it. And I didn't even show you much with regard to the filter or derez. I did a little quick demo of derez, but honestly, go and play with it. This one is designed, like I'm putting it in the basic category of consolidated, because this one is designed that you should be able to play with it and do fun things with it. What you'll get out of that is a bunch of classic sounds, like you might have heard off of records, or you might have heard sounds like this in clubs in the UK in the 90s or something like that, because it'll be consistent with stuff that people did when they were fairly naive and didn't know all of the tricks that I do in my fancier reverbs to make them sound more like a realistic space. Because the realistic space stuff tends to echo the 70s or the 60s or the 50s more, because that's when people had to do these tricks by putting up a mic. And that's all very interesting, but all eras of sound have interesting things to them. And I'm happy to bring you one where there's fun stuff to be had. I hope you enjoy VerbTiny. I'll keep working on more stuff, and I'm here every week, so I'll have something else next week. See you later. Bye-bye.